Welcome back, everyone, to the Federal Reserve Worksheet, Part 1. Since the rules are not allowing recording of Zoom meetings, I've had to create this new thing so that you guys can follow along and still see recordings, even if you can't make a meeting. So we're going to go on our Federal Reserve Worksheet. We're going to cover Part 1. That's the first page. So what you're going to be looking at right now is essentially this. We're going to go ahead and start covering the front page. So remember, a good idea right now is to type in your name, put your period up here, and even fill in the date. Now, as we're covering the Federal Reserve, what's good to remember about this whole thing is that the Federal Reserve, which we've already covered, is a bank. If you guys need a quick review on how banks work and the fractional reserve banking system, maybe you want to pay attention to this video here. Remember, if you take $100 and put it into a bank, your money is not actually sitting right there in the bank. The bank is actually going to go ahead right there and they're going to loan out 90 of those dollars, or 90%, and hold 10% in reserves. Remember, reserves are the amount of money that a bank holds on to and does not lend out. Now, if you loaned out that $90, someone would get a $90 loan, they'd spend it. So now someone else then has $90 and they put it in the bank. The bank then holds on to 10%, which would be $9, and loan out the other 90%, in this case would be $81, and see how it gets smaller each time. So they'll keep doing this over and over again, and it's basically how the bank can create money. The bank can start right here with $100, but then they're going to get $90 of spending and $81 of spending, and then so on and so forth. And that $100 will actually end up acting like $1,000. So just remember, this is how banks work. They hold some money in reserves and loan the rest out. And the money that they are holding in reserves is what they give to you when you say, I'd like to make a withdrawal. They don't really have all your money. They just have some of it. And that's what allowing them to make that payment back to you. They're going to take some of your reserves and some of other people's reserves. And so long as they have enough reserves, they can always meet it. But if they run out, we're going to have bad problems, which we'll get to in a moment. So back to our Federal Reserve worksheet, we're going to go back to one of those features that we mentioned that banks have. It's a service they provide you that you probably take for granted a lot. And that is, the Federal Reserve has many jobs, but besides playing the role of the nation's check clearer. And what check clearing is this: if I were to write you a check, so I scribble that check and hand it to you, assume it's on paper, you would take that check to your bank. You'd tell your bank, hey, I would like to deposit this check in your bank account. But remember, that money that's in that check is in my bank account at a totally different bank. What your bank is going to do is they're going to go ahead and take a copy of that check and they're going to send it to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve will then take that copy of the check and they'll contact my bank, making sure that all the numbers and everything are correct and that my account has as much money as what I said I owe you. When they've confirmed all that, they will make sure that my bank withdraws the exact amount that was on the check and that that exact amount is also deposited back in your bank. This makes sure that no other banks are just saying, yeah, add money to your account, but maybe not withdrawing from my account, allowing money to just inflate because it gets transferred but never deducted, which is a really important feature. So the Federal Reserve plays the nations as a check clearer. And this is when, as I just said, the Federal Reserve takes checks from one that have been turned into one bank and perfectly transfers the money over to another bank or a bank account. So they make sure it's accurate and correct always. So now that we've covered that, we can move on. The Federal Reserve is considered to be the central bank of the United States. Central banking is something that most modern and wealthy countries have. They have a central bank that's in charge of all the other banks and their country's money supply. So because it is the central bank of the United States, this means that it is a bank to which other banks can get loans from. Think, if Citibank was running low on money, they need to get a loan. Well, they could get a loan from other banks, but if they couldn't get loans from other banks, they could always get it from the Federal Reserve. So think if Citigroup was running low on reserves and they needed more. If times were tough and they said, hey, Bank of America, or hey, Chase, can I get a loan? And those two banks said, no way. Citibank could always go to the Federal Reserve and get a loan from them to make sure that they don't collapse. So the Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States, and that means it's a bank which other banks can get loans from. For this reason, it's considered to be the lender of last resort. What the lender of last resort means is that it's the bank to which other banks can go to get money to stay in business if no other bank will lend them money. So it's the lender of last resort. Usually Citigroup will go to other banks to get loans, but if those banks won't give it money and it really, really needs it, it can always go to the Federal Reserve to get money. So it's the lender of last resort. So that's what we're describing right there. Now, another thing that the Federal Reserve is important for is keeping of reserves. What this means is this: the Federal Reserves are money that a bank holds on to and doesn't lend out. So think, when you put that $100 into your bank account, the bank is holding on to like 10%, so $10 of it, and loaning out the rest. So the $10 that the bank is not loaning out is its reserves, as in they're holding it in reserve. They're holding it in the bank. All right. Now, banks hold on to reserves to make sure they can always give you money if you come to them and ask for it. And it makes you feel like the bank always has all your money at all times. Even though they don't, this is how it makes you feel, because most people don't take their money out of the bank at any one time. Now, banks keep reserves. Now, the amount of reserves that a bank is required to hold on to and not lend out is called the reserve requirement. It's really easy to remember that. Banks need to keep reserves, but the amount of reserves they're required to hold on to is the reserve requirement. So they can, if they have to keep on to, so if the reserve requirement was 10%, then they have to keep on to 10% of all the deposits. However, if a bank goes ahead and wants to hold on to $15 or $30 or 30%, they can. It's called excess reserves. But they can never hold on to less than the reserve requirement. So if the reserve requirement is 10%, they can hold on to more, but they can never hold on to less, because it's the required reserve requirement. Now, the reserve requirement does play an important role to how stable or unstable a bank is. What it means is this: a bank with small reserves is considered to be more profitable. The thing is, if a bank holds on to less money, that means it has more money to lend out. And if it can lend out more money, it can get more interest and therefore make more profit. So a bank with small reserves is considered to be more profitable, but let me go ahead and redo that one. A bank with small reserves is considered to be more profitable. That should probably go here. But then they would be less stable. That would be here. So a bank with small reserves is less stable, but more profitable. What this means is this: if a bank has small reserves, that means that it can lend more money out and be more profitable, which is right there. However, if a bank has small reserves, that means when people go to the bank and try to get their money out, it won't take as many people going to the bank to get their money out to have the bank run out of money and therefore be bankrupt. So a bank has small reserves. It has a very little amount of money on hand to give to their depositors if those depositors want to make a withdrawal. So the bank would be considered to be less stable, but more profitable. Now, on the other hand, I bet you could probably figure this part out on yourself. If a bank has large reserves, it's considered to be more stable. That means they're holding on to more of your money. So if more depositors come, they can still meet those depositors' withdrawals because they had a lot of money in reserves. But if they're more stable, it means that banks are less profitable. So remember, if a bank has high reserves, they're not as profitable. That means they're charging you higher interest rates to get a loan, which would kind of be bad for the customer too. So the thing is, the Federal Reserve controls what we call the reserve requirement. That means they decide how much a bank has to hold on to. So they're deciding how stable a bank is, but also how profitable a bank is as well. Because the Fed wants banks to be profitable, but they also want them to be stable. And it's a really important balance for them to keep. Now, one of the things we need to cover, and the big point of covering the Federal Reserve, is dealing with the money supply. There is a supply of money in the economy. What it means is how many dollars are essentially out there being used at any one time. Remember, if the Fed were to increase the money supply, and therefore there'd be lots and lots of money in the economy, we would have a problem, which we'll get to down here at the bottom. So the money supply, which is what goes in right here, is all the money in the US economy. It's a very, very simple concept. It's the supply of money. So the money supply is how many dollars are in the US economy being used at any one time. Now, you might ask yourself, there's a lot, you might actually not be asking yourself, you might be thinking, hey, so we just count all the dollars. Well, it's not that easy because there's lots of different types of money. There's money that's liquid, there's money that's close to liquid, and there's some money not being used at all. For example, if there was a suitcase full of money and it fell off a boat and is sitting at the bottom of the ocean, 10 miles deep, that money is not in the money supply because it's never going to be used. But if the cash in your pocket you're going to use to go to the store, that money is very liquid and can be used anytime, and therefore it definitely is part of the money supply because it's going to be used often. So what the Federal Reserve uses to measure the money supply is what we call M1, which you can kind of see right here, and what goes in that box, M2. So it's M1 and M2. That is what the Federal Reserve uses to control the money supply. Now, M1 consists of things, and if you wanted to kind of give yourself a little note, M1 is all the money that is very liquid. What liquid means is money that can be spent immediately. So M1 consists of the three types of money that you can spend right now. The first type right there is what we call physical currency. Physical currency is an easy concept for you because it's the money sitting in your wallet right now. Any physical cash, any coins, that is all physical currency. So how long does it take for you to spend physical currency? The answer is immediately, therefore it's M1. Now, on the other hand, we have something called M2. And what M2 consists of is this. M2 consists of the other type of money that you spend right away, which would be called demand deposits. Now, I'm sure you might not be calling things demand deposits, but what demand deposits are is they're also called checkable deposits. It's money in your checking account. For example, you may be using your check card or debit card, which pulls money right out of your check account to buy stuff. How long does it take for you to use your checking account or money in your checking account to buy things? The answer is immediately. You hit swipe and boom, that money is gone. So M1 consists of all physical currency as well as demand deposits, also called checkable deposits. You might want to put both there. So if you see one, you know that it's checking account and therefore M1. The third type is traveler's checks. And what traveler's checks was solving a problem you guys don't really have anymore. It was something I actually used when I was a kid. You would go to the bank and get a booklet full of traveler's checks. So I would give them like $200 and they give me $200 worth of traveler's checks. What you would do is you would sign each one of them in one of the blanks and the other blank you left blank. What it was for is travelers. So if I were to travel to Chicago, I would need, and we were talking about like 40, 50 years ago, I would have to bring all that money in cash because credit cards weren't very popular. Debit cards weren't a thing. ATMs to my bank where the money is didn't exist. So if I went to Chicago, I'd have to bring a lot of cash to pay for my hotel, to pay for a rental car, to pay for all my meals and trips and whatever else I'm doing, which means I need to bring a lot of cash. So imagine if I was walking around and someone knew I was a tourist, I could get robbed. And if I got robbed, I'm out of money. So how do I necessarily get home? Or how do I pay my hotel bill or my next dinner? I wouldn't really have a way except for by trying to get someone to wire money to me, which would be a longer, difficult, and expensive process. So what I could do is I could have those traveler's checks and I could get a lot of them and I'd sign each one once and the other one was blank. So what I would do is I'd go to the store counter and I'd want to pay in a traveler's check And I would then, in front of the clerk, I'd say, hey, watch as I sign the other blank, and give them the traveler's check. They would take that just as cash. So if I gave them a $50 traveler's check and I was only buying $20 worth of goods, they would give me $30 back in physical currency. Now, I know traveler's checks aren't something you're used to, but now you know what they are. And now you know that they're the third part of M1, which consists of physical currency, demand deposits, and traveler's checks. They're obviously the smallest part of M1. Now, the other thing the Fed uses to measure how much money is in the economy is something called M2. M2 is what we call near money, as in it's money you can spend, but it takes a little while for you to be able to do that. So the example of this is, first, M2 consists of all of M1. So if you're wondering what's bigger, M2 or M1, the answer must be M2, because it's all of M1 plus some other things. In fact, it's much larger. It's like 3 or 4 times bigger. So M2 consists of all of M1 and what we call near money. Remember, it's money you can spend, but you can't spend it right now. You have to do something first before you can spend it. So an example would be your savings account. So the first type of M2 is savings, or money in savings accounts. Now you might be saying, I can spend money in my savings account, and indeed you can, but you can't do it right now. First, you would have to move the money from your savings account and put it into a checking account or ask for it in cash. So you'd have to turn that into purely M1 before you can spend it. So could you spend your savings account money right now? No, you'd have to put it in your checking account. Could you spend it today or in an hour? Definitely, but you have to do something first. So it's not quite as liquid as M1. So we put it in M2, so savings accounts. The second type is what we call money market accounts. Money market account is like a savings account, except you're giving your money to the bank and allowing them to use that money to give other banks loans, which means you get more interest, usually double the rate of a savings account. So in a money market account, what this means is that, you can go to the bank, and you could go today and say, give me my money from my money market account, and they would give it to you, and so you could still spend it today. So it's near money. It's something you can spend quickly, but not right now. Now, the third type of money we have here is what are called other time deposits. And what you want to put by other time deposits is that it's a CD, or a certificate of deposit. By the way, pay attention to this one, because this is probably where you should have your money right now if you're saving for college. A CD is a time deposit, as in you give your money to the bank and you sort of promise not to touch it for a certain amount of time. Now, CDs can be 1-month CDs, 3-month CDs, 6-month, 9-month, a year, 18-month, 2 years. That's about the longest I've really seen, but I bet you could find something that would even go longer. So if you're not going to use your money for 6 months, a CD is a really good place to go, because you give the bank your money and you promise not to touch it until it's up. Now, they'll give you more interest, maybe up to, right now, almost up to 3%. So with 3%, that means a bunch of different things are happening. You're getting more interest, but your money isn't as liquid. Now, you might say, you said M2, though, is pretty liquid money. And I did. Because if you wanted to today, you could go to the bank and say, hey, bank, give me the money in my CD. And they're like, but you promised not to touch it. And you're like, yeah, but I want it now. And they go, okay, but we're not giving you the interest we promised. And then you'd have to give up that interest to get your money now. So you can still get all your money. You'll just have to have an interest penalty. So you can get your money today, but you can't spend it right now. You have to do something first. So M2 consists of all of M1 plus savings, plus money market accounts, and certificates of deposits, or other time deposits, as well as all of M1. So someone would say, what if I took money from my savings account and I put it in my checking account? Well, what would happen to M1 and M2? Here's where things get a little tricky. A lot of people say M2 or M1 would increase, and that is correct. A lot of people would also say M2 would decrease, and that is where they would be wrong. Because M2 consists of all of M1, you could say savings accounts decreased by, let's say, $100. But The checking account increased by $100. So while M1 went up 100, you think M2 went down 100, but remember, M1 is also in M2. So how much did it change? None. It's equal. So it's kind of a tricky thing for you to think of and try to walk yourself through going from one to the other. For example, if you put $100 that was in physical currency and you put it into a money market account, what would happen to M1? Well, M1 would go down $100. However, M2 would stay the same. That's because what would happen is M2 went down, or I'm sorry, M1 went down because physical currency is smaller. You're going to think M2 went up, but it went up that $100, but M1 went down. And since M2 consists of all of M1, if it goes down and one goes up, they actually do the same thing. So just kind of remember that while M1 might change a lot, M2 tends to be the same. Just a tricky question sometimes you might see. All right, moving on, and to get to our last part is we need to know how the money supply affects what we call inflation. Remember, if I increase the amount of money in the economy, for example, if M1 or M2 change, if they increase, that means more people have money. And if more people have money, they're going to go to the stores and shops and buy more things. So if they go and they buy more things, that means stores will run out of goods. And if stores run out of goods, they need to order more. So when they go to order more and they've run out, they're going to say, I'm going to want to buy more. That costs them more money. Therefore, they raise prices. Think, if I had a shop and I sold out every day at noon, well, then I'm going to just want to raise my prices because I'll still sell the same amount, but still the same amount of people want to buy it. So if every store is running out of goods, every store raises their prices until they stop running out and get to what we'll call equilibrium, which is something we'll cover in micro. So as all the stores raise their prices, that's called inflation. The opposite. So if there's an increase in the money supply, that means there's more money in the economy. This would increase inflation. So the Federal Reserve controls the money supply. That means they control the inflation rate. So if more money's in the economy, inflation will increase. On the other hand, if there's a decrease in the money supply, that would mean there would be less M1 and less M2, which means people had less money. And if they had less money, they buy fewer things. So if I'm a store and no one's buying my stuff, what do I do to get people to buy it? The answer is I lower my prices. And if all stores are lowering their prices, we'd have something called deflation. Or if we're having lower inflation, it's called disinflation. So if there's a decrease in the money supply, this would reduce inflation or create something called deflation. Now, that is all we're covering so far. We're going to get into how the Federal Reserve controls the money supply in our next video. And those three ways are the reserve requirement. They also use open market operations. And the last tool they use is a discount rate, which is going to be an important thing for you to know as we get to things down here. And you are going to take the role of the Fed chairman and have to control the economy through a game that you'll see down here. All right. Until next time, I hope you guys are understanding these worksheets, and I'll post the next video very, very soon.